Good afternoon. Chris and Peter, earlier this year you co-authored a paper on climate change for policymakers and business leaders. What caused you to write this paper?
Should I start?
Sure.
You know, one of the biggest challenges with confronting the climate issue was that there are so many different groups of stakeholders that are involved. There are people whose primary interest is in protecting the environment, people whose primary interest is in ensuring vibrant economic growth in developed countries, in developing countries, in ensuring that we have a sustainable energy future. And it's very difficult to pull together the expertise to address this wide range of issues, especially over the range of timescales that's involved from any single disciplinary perspective. The science of climate change is very, very advanced, and we've made a lot of progress with it. But the solution set really involves a very deep and important dialogue with the private sector and the business community. As Peter and I discuss the issues of climate impacts and sensible policy solutions, what we realized is that if the problem's presented from any individual perspective, you typically can't come to the kind of understanding that lets you really make progress. And we felt that by working together, we could help people understand the range of issues and help them see where the solutions really make sense.
You know, all that I would add to that is that nowhere had there been an example in the world where we had combined the expertise of scientists with maybe the pragmatism and demands that are imposed upon a CEO. And so I thought that there had been much work done in the scientific community, but people in business tend to think, well, science, that's over there, but it doesn't relate to me. And sometimes with the business world, people really weren't grounded, nor did they have credibility. And so the thought that I had as we approached the project is we had the credibility of just a tremendously respected expert and scientist in the field, together with the pragmatic view of not only a CEO, but one who came up through the ranks of finance and being a chief financial officer. And most people know in companies there's nobody more realistic or pragmatic or sometimes less pleasant than a CFO. And so bringing these two perspectives together, I thought would create a unique perspective that both the scientific community as well as the business community could relate to and therefore offer something incremental to what had been done before.
Well, as a follow-up to that, Peter, what do you see as the role of a business leader or a scientist as an activist in this area?
You know, generally I don't think about people in business as being an activist, but through early on in becoming a CEO, I had spent most of my career in the previous 6 years dealing with the financial and energy crisis that we had in California. So I didn't really have a view on climate change and came to it with a pragmatic financial view, but combined with a view that, hey, you know, there are issues of conscience and morality here, and I felt that I couldn't be comfortable doing my job if we had engaged in activity that was very bad for people and for the earth and the environment. And so the conclusion that I came to was we needed to really get into this and understand it. So the top 15 people in the company met with the leading scientists on both sides of the issue. And out of that came a conclusion on behalf of our company, which was the earth is warming, mankind is most likely responsible, and the need for action is now. So once we had that, the responsibility I felt as a responsible business person and citizen was that we as a company had to do all we could to reduce our carbon emissions. But knowing that we would continue to emit carbon, I said to myself, from a standpoint of accountability, what more ought you be doing? Since you will emit some carbon, how can you be comfortable from a conscience standpoint and from an accountable business leader? And the conclusion that I came to was that we ought to be a leader in our industry, educating and encouraging other utilities to emit less carbon. And so we've been engaged in that effort now for about 5 years, and it hasn't always been popular, but it's certainly been provocative.
Chris, what would you say about as a scientist in the role of an activist here?
I think it's important to distinguish between the role of an activist and the role of an advocate. I see the responsibility of the scientific community to presenting the information that's available and letting the stakeholders, the individuals, the companies, the governments use that information, hopefully to make good decisions. The problem I think we've faced with climate is it's been difficult to get the agenda on the table. People have tended to criticize the science, often unfairly. They've tended to say, oh, maybe it's an important issue, but it's so far off in the future that we don't need to deal with it. Or they've said, well, it's scary that it might be so complicated and expensive to deal with the issue. What I see from the perspective of a scientist who is committed to seeing a good dialogue that's based on what we know is that unless the science of climate change can be communicated clearly, the fact that the Earth has warmed, the fact that we have high confidence that the warming that we've already seen is due to human actions, and the fact that the longer we wait, the more complicated and difficult it gets to deal with these issues, are things that people need to understand. And I think the scientific community, in collaboration with the broader side, has a real responsibility to confront the issues and to make decisions now when the decisions can be made in a sensible way that's not terribly expensive and that can allow vibrant economic development to continue.
Well, what is it that we know for certain? What is the fingerprint evidence of climate change, and what's still to be proven?
You know, we've understood the physics of the way that greenhouse gases influence climate at a basic level since really the middle of the 19th century. A brilliant Swedish chemist named Svante Arrhenius published a paper in 1896, more than 110 years ago, in which he outlined the role of carbon dioxide in influencing global temperature. He understood that lots of carbon dioxide was being emitted to the atmosphere as a result of combustion of coal. He understood that if you increase the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it will tend to make the climate warmer. He understood that in a warmer climate, you would tend to get more evaporation, with the water vapor amplifying the effect of the CO2. And he understood that some of the CO2 would be partitioned into the oceans. But those are the foundational elements of the way we understand climate change now. And they really haven't been questioned for more than 100 years. There are many uncertainties still, but those uncertainties concern the strength or weakness of feedback mechanisms, including things like how reflective sea ice is, whether there are more or less clouds. And the important thing to recognize is that those feedback mechanisms control whether in the future we see a very large amount of warming or a modest amount of warming. We've also reached the point now where the biggest controller on how much warming we see in the future is what we do, how many greenhouse gases we emit to the atmosphere. And that's one of the reasons that it's important to have this kind of dialogue. There's no doubt that the Earth's surface temperature has warmed. It's warmed almost 1 centigrade degree over the last century. There's no doubt that the concentration of important greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane, have increased dramatically. CO2 is now more than 30% higher than it was during the pre-industrial era. And there's no doubt that that's a consequence of human activities, a combination of cutting forests and burning fossil fuels. And we have very high confidence that the warming that we're seeing now is a consequence, at least partly, of these extra greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The final thing we know for sure is that if we continue to emit greenhouse gases, the Earth's temperature will continue to warm. We also know with very high level of confidence that we're already seeing impacts of climate change and that they're disrupting people's lives, economic activities, and ecosystems. What we don't know is where we're headed in the future, partly because we need to make decisions about where we're headed, and partly because the science of these feedbacks is still uncertain. As we go on today, one of the main themes I want to communicate is that even though we don't know all the details, we could still make good decisions. And I think that's the most critical missing element that needs to be a piece of the dialogue on climate change.
Well, staying on this science thread for a while, I want to get back to business, but staying on that thread, you talked about confidence levels just now. You co-chaired the second working group of the last Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I read through that, and there's a lot of talk about confidence levels, risks, probabilities, things that scientists and hopefully engineers all understand. But What about the layperson or even more so the lay politician? How do you communicate those types of things to those people?
You know, in general, in our everyday decisions, I think people are used to making decisions under uncertainty. Every time you decide whether to buckle your seatbelt or buy insurance for your house, invest in a financial market, you make a decision where you have incomplete information and where you may have a sense of what the odds are. You may not even have a good sense of what the odds are. And I think that we have good tools for making decisions under uncertainty, either at the individual level or at the business level or at the government level. And I think the thing that's critically important for people to understand is that with climate change, we have a relatively clear picture of where the uncertainties are, and we have decisions that need to be made under uncertainty. And, you know, an example is that we know for sure that the Earth will continue to warm even if we were to stop emitting all greenhouse gases. And partly there's a sense of the inertia that's built into the climate system. You can think of the climate as a freight train, and if you take away the fuel, it'll continue to coast for a long time. The climate system works like that. We don't know for sure whether it'll coast to half a degree warmer than now or a degree and a half warmer than now. We don't know for sure whether if we emit another, let's say, 500 billion tons of carbon to the atmosphere, we'll end up with an average global temperature that's 3 Celsius or 5 Celsius warmer than now. But we can structure the odds of that in a pretty compelling way, and I think the kinds of decisions people need to make are decisions that look at those odds and say, how much of an insurance policy do I want to buy in order to maintain a probability of a sustainable future that I'm comfortable with?
Well, I want to switch to a couple of business questions. Maybe we do a little alternating back and forth here. So, Peter, as a CEO, isn't your job to make Wall Street happy and worry about next quarter's earnings? How does that work into this picture?
Well, you know, a lot of people raise the question of, is it climate change or is it earnings for Wall Street? In fact, our employees sometimes raise the question, is it about working safely or is it about earnings for the company? And in the past, some of them have said, is it about financial controls or is it profitability? And I think the people that raise those questions don't really understand business. There's some CEOs out there, I think a lot, that are very short-sighted and feel that the way to maximize earnings is each quarter you deliver the maximum earnings that you can and line up all those quarters, and that's what's best for the company overall. Well, let's think about that. One could pollute like crazy, not just carbon, but others, and receive all sorts of fines and bad PR. One could stop doing maintenance on your business. That would reduce expense and maximize earnings in any one quarter. Or one could stop investing in the business and maximize the return on equity. So those are all things that could maximize the returns this quarter, but leave the company in a very bad position over time. We developed a strategy a number of years ago for ensuring the future of PG&E. And first, it's focus on customers and understand what those customer needs are. And secondly, develop operational excellence and run the business very well. Now, I want to confess that it's been harder to change an organization of 20,000 people in 100 years to make that happen, so it may not always be evident to you. But that's what we're very focused on. And our belief is if you take care of the customer, you serve them well, you run your business efficiently, and you're a responsible corporate citizen, that will be the thing that ensures that PG&E lasts and is here and strong and viable 100 years from now, just like it was 100 years ago. But on the other hand, if you're very short-sighted every quarter trying to maximize that quarter, that you will maximize the quarter and destroy the company in the long term. So I've asked myself the question, is it best to be responsible about the emissions of carbon, just as it is to be responsible about the emissions of any other pollutant? and to try and serve our customers well and responsibly over the long term while keeping an eye on quarterly earnings? Or should you maximize things in the reverse and maximize the quarter? So our decision has been we're going to manage the company for 100 years and kind of make sure we don't go too off target with respect to quarterly earnings. There is an oil company that you're probably all familiar with, and I had the opportunity to talk with their chairman years ago. And his approach was maximize the quarter. What you've seen is there was a lot of focus, it would appear, on operational expense and reducing it, and perhaps cutting quarters. And it has hurt the reputation of that company tremendously. It has led to billions of dollars of fines and penalties and claims. So there's a perfect example of a company right there that has focused, according to their CEO, that talking to years back, focused on maximizing the quarter and completely did damage to the long-term viability of that company. So I think that's just a case in point, not only for me, but for you, that supports the thesis that I put forward about how to manage a company optimally.
You know, if I can just add a quick thought, this philosophy that we want a vibrant economy, vibrant ecosystems, and vibrant society in 100 years is a very appropriate one for managing the climate system as well. That you can either think short term, we don't have big consequences of the greenhouse gases today that we're emitting today, or you can think long term when the consequences of those emissions really begin to pile up. And I think there is a strong convergence between the business perspective and the environmental perspective on that issue.
Yes, let me add to that, Jim. Mr. Darbee, I think you referred to ethical leadership, and I can share with you that our students are really passionate about this climate change issue and renewable energy. So I have students came to me and say, I just want to work on renewable energy because that's, for me, that's very important to me as an individual, as an engineer, and as a citizen. So we're talking about if an organization is very ethically led, and then that will be very empowering to the employees. They say, I want to be part of the effort.
And you know, that's why I'm here today. What I have found is when I've gone out and talked to industry leaders, many of the people that I talk to and other CEOs are like, we don't want to hear it. But when I talk to my children who are ages 23, 25, and 27, they get it. They get that climate change is going to impact them just like you. Whereas the 55-year-olds and 60-year-olds who are running the country, a lot of them aren't going to be around when the consequences come home. So, you know, in their minds, they can afford to focus on, let's run our company, maximize the profits now, and let others worry about it down the road. I have a moral problem with that. And I want to say the reason I'm here and Chris is here talking to the young people who will be the leaders of tomorrow is because you can make a difference. The legacy of climate change is going to hit you and your children. And you can make a difference now by the decisions you take in supporting it. The only other thing I would say about those interested in renewables, always think of energy efficiency first. The best way to stave off, and the cheapest way to stave off climate change, is work on energy efficiency first, which costs about 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour. Whereas renewables, you're talking about the cost of kilowatt hour of 10 to 15 cents or even 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So your focus on renewables is admirable, but always start with energy efficiency first.
With that in mind, Dean, what's happening in San Jose State in those areas?
Yes, and then this really requires a comprehensive approach. You know, the technology from developing, and just share with you what's going on in the college engineering that you know, professors work and students work. You know, we we have professors working on the materials just for making the solar cells more efficient, and also storage is a big issue, and supercapacitor, and also building. So when you think about it, the technology side really covers all engineering disciplines. And from building, that's the civil and environmental engineering, and materials, and as I mentioned, that, and of course mechanical and the solar and the electric car. We have because we can run through here, the building the hybrid car and zero emission car and to a zero emission house. And so not to mention electrical engineering, working on the smart grid and control. And as you mentioned earlier, the energy efficiency is the cheapest, the cleanest power source. And actually, we have an ongoing project of improving the energy efficiency of consumer electronics. And thinking that here, consumer electronics and with Silicon Valley, that's where it is designed and not manufactured, but it's designed and conceived. And then our students are avid users of consumer electronics. I just say, for those of you who don't have any electronics with you, please raise your hand.
Well, I wanted to go back to this concept of everybody in this room, I think, understands, but the decision makers that need to set the policies going forward don't necessarily understand, and the general public doesn't necessarily understand. The Pew Research Center did a survey last year where they, really a true-up from a survey they did a year and a half before, where they found the number of people that believed that there's an issue with climate change had dropped from 71% to 57%. How do you turn that around? How do you get the general population to understand this issue?
It's a really hard question. I think that what we've seen in the last year or so is that organized interest, some reflect the corporate interests of fossil-based companies. Some reflect groups that are concerned about damage to the economy, have in many cases had an organized disinformation campaign. The international scientific community has had some very serious missteps with errors in IPCC reports or with the stolen emails from the University of East Anglia. I think we saw sort of a media feeding frenzy that resulted in climate change being in the press for really a lot of unfavorable reasons. We also saw something that was kind of unexpected. During the decade from 2000 to 2008, global average temperatures didn't really increase that much. And we know some of the reasons for that, and some of them we don't know. What's happened in the last couple of years is that pattern's really dramatically switched. I think most people have seen the news reports that the last 12 months have been the warmest 12 months in record. It looks likely that 2010 will be the warmest year since we got thermometers. And I think we've seen something else that's terribly important for understanding climate change. And it's a series of events that we tend to characterize as once in 500-year events or once in 10,000-year events. And it includes things like the horrific wildfires that they had in Melbourne in early 2009, the serious wildfires in the Moscow area this summer, or the horrible floods in Pakistan. And in climate science, we can't attribute those events to climate change unambiguously. But what we know is that the probability of that kind of event increases dramatically as we continue to put pressure on the climate system. And my sense is that we're now in an era where individuals' experience with climate change, individuals' personal experience with climate change is really getting to the stage where people will feel compelled to confront the evidence. And I think that it'd be nice if the communications efforts were smoothly flowing and efficient. But I think the way the world works is what's going to eventually convince people that this is a topic we need to take action on. Just as a comment, the kind of thing that's influencing us here in California is that over the last 50 years, the amount of water that's in the snowpack when we measure it, which is the 1st of April in the Sierras, has gone down by about 30%. California, as you know, is a very water-poor state, and about half of our water storage capacity is the state's reservoir. The other half is the snowpack. And we already, as a consequence of the relatively modest amount of warming we've already seen, have lost 30% of that water resource on average. And that's going to be a really serious problem for us. It's just an example of the kinds of things that have already occurred that are going to start sort of working their way through the system and make this an issue that you can't ignore.
Peter, you've been very active in Washington. You've testified multiple times in the Senate. Things changed in the November election, and things look very different going forward in Washington. And most people say the cap and trade bill is most likely dead. Where do we go to with here on how to do something in Washington?
You know, that's a topic that I've been spending a tremendous amount of time on and talking with leaders on. And I believe that for the foreseeable future, cap and trade is dead in Washington. We're trying to implement it in California, and if we can make it work effectively in California and have a model under Assembly Bill 32, that could be helpful. Most lately, I've started to take another tact, and it's an approach that's been recommended by both the certain Republicans as well as certain Democrats. And in particular, Arthur Laffer, a Republican economist, together with Al Gore, who actually I spoke with just this morning prior to this meeting, both, so from the left and from the right, have said, you know, a tax on carbon might not be a bad idea. Now, normally, the people right of center would say, oh, here we go again. And so the strategy that I've thought about is the following, to say, you know, let's stop arguing about climate change because, you know, the Democrats will never convince the Republicans and vice versa. And it's frustrating and it takes a lot of energy out of the room. But from a political perspective, I'm not talking about with you all, but with the politicians, to say, you know, to the Republicans, how would you like to see a reduction in taxes on dividends? And they'd say, we'd like that. How would you like to have a reduction in taxes on savings, i.e. interest? And they'd say, I'd like that. How would you like to see a reduction in the tax on capital gains? The Republicans would say, I'd like that. And then how about a reduction in payroll taxes that would create more jobs? And Republicans say, I like that. So the idea would be to say, you all Republicans, you'd like a reduction in taxes on those things, which you actually call good and virtuous things. It's work, it's savings, it's investment. And we Democrats, we'd like to see a tax on carbon. So let's not get into science and all. Let's get into horse trading politicians. Now, the big issue with that historically has been that the American public sees it as an opportunity to raise taxes. So my idea is this, is to set it up so we would have the bipartisan Congressional Budget Office that has a huge amount of credibility with both parties. To say to them, okay, you set the tax rate on carbon. So let's say in the first year, I'll choose a number, 50 billion. We raise 50 billion in taxes. And we're going to have a reduction on the taxes associated with dividends, savings, capital gains, and things like that. The same. Now, people will say, hey, you know, you guys, you politicians will you know, set the things in place so you'll wind up raising more taxes over here and it'll be net a tax increase. But what I propose is there be an adjustment mechanism like we have at PG&E under regulation by the CPUC, California Public Utilities Commission, where you do a year, and to the extent that it didn't come out just right, you have a rebate in the immediate next quarter, or if it's a large amount, over 2 quarters. And so the Congressional Budget Office would have to opine every year, you know, that we have these rates so that the net increase in taxes is 0. And so what's gone through my mind is we have to find certain people in both parties that are open to looking at this in an unemotional way and to think about it rationally rather than emotionally and to say, if we could have reduction in taxes on interest, capital gains, you know, savings and things like that and payroll, wouldn't that be good? And I'll tell you, Republicans in general, they've been fighting for that, you know, for quite a while. And so the one hitch would be is, okay, is there a way we can assure ourselves that, you know, it's not a game of overall raising taxes. So that might work. The other big problem is everybody said, well, not the U.S. first, because it puts us at a competitive disadvantage. And so despite the fact that I'm a free trade advocate and have been for decades, I think it makes sense to say we're going to have a tax or tariff on goods imported from outside the United States equal to our carbon tax. So they look at, what is the carbon component? And so goods coming into the United States will be taxed so that our goods are competitive with international goods and we don't disadvantage our own companies. So that's the state of development right now, and what a number of people have said is, PG&E, write that thing up. We want to think about it and look at it and all of that, and I'm sure other people will have lots of good ideas, and if people here in the audience have good ideas about how we can make it even better, we'd appreciate that. But I'm afraid that the issue has been so politicized that, no matter, you can't begin to have a logical, rational discussion about it with some people, and I find that even in my own family, and with brothers and sisters of mine. And so to move the discussion out of the irrational area to something that politicians are used to, which is horse trading, I think that would work in Congress. I think there's a need, as Chris has said, for the general populace to understand this big issue and to say this is something we need to deal with. So that's my latest strategy I'm working on.
Thank you. I want to open up for questions in just a minute, but before I do that, Chris, Cancun. What's going on in Cancun right now, and do you think it's going to make a difference?
Well, as people know, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed in 1992. For 18 years now, we've had a climate convention that has as its explicit goal preventing what's called dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, preventing climate from changing enough so that people and ecosystems are impacted. The data I see tells me that there are already dangerous anthropogenic impacts in some ecosystems and some economies. So the treaty hasn't been 100% successful. Most of you probably know that last year's Conference of the Parties, which was held in Copenhagen, there were high hopes for coming up with a global binding agreement that would let the kinds of policies that Peter's talking about move forward. And I view the meeting that's currently going on in Cancun, scheduled to end tomorrow, as more of a build a foundation so that we can take more comprehensive action later. The way that these conventions work is that all of the agreements have to be made by consensus. Every country has to agree. Very, very challenging environment, and it's one where the focus this year in Cancun is on two relatively simple things. One is on figuring out the right way to do credits for forestry, and that's a real opportunity for win-win situations where you can protect biodiversity, protect forests, at the same time you prevent emissions of carbon and other heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere. The other thing that I hope we'll see some progress on in Cancun is what's called an Adaptation Fund. This would be a fund that all the world's countries, developed countries, contribute to, that developing countries can use to help their people deal with the climate change impacts that can't be avoided. Adaptation Fund doesn't need to be big in order to be effective, and my hope is that if we can see an agreement on Adaptation Fund and on forestry, we'll do two things. One, we will actually help the climate in a meaningful way, and we'll help people who need help. But I think we'll also begin to build the international confidence that's going to be necessary to move ahead. But my personal expectation is over the next several years, we're going to see the leadership coming from diverse places and not just from the UN process. The state of California is a beautiful example of a big organizational unit that's taken real leadership on this. And I think we'll see lots of bilateral or multilateral arrangements where people who care deeply about the issue find a way to come together, in some cases totally independent of the UN process, and in some cases directly supporting it.
Thank you. I'd like to take questions from the audience, and we have a microphone back there. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll bring a microphone to you.
First of all, I'd like to thank you all for a wonderful talk. You talked a lot about carbon emissions. So I'd just like to ask you, given the current financial setup and the climate change in the state of California, how do you see the whole concept of buying and selling carbon credits for California? As you mentioned, it's not really up in Washington, so how do you see that affecting the state of California, the whole cap and trade policy?
Well, we're working actually very closely with the California Air Resources Board to develop that. And what will be key is getting that market up and running. One of the things that PG&E has pioneered in is trying to make sure that that market works right and doesn't get dysfunctional, either by the prices being too low, which we saw in Europe. We saw in Europe the prices really run up and then the prices collapse. Part of the reason for that was the collapse is that there hadn't been an inventory that had been done previously so that people knew how many allowances to issue with accuracy. And so I think in the beginning what happened was financial players came in to try and hoard the allowances and the price shot up. And then people realized, looking at supply and demand, that there were too many allowances, and then the price collapsed. And that wasn't helpful. So what we focused on, having observed the energy crisis and how the energy markets went out of control, we said if we're going to be a proponent of cap and trade, we want something called a cost collar. And that would establish a ceiling on carbon as well as a floor on the price of carbon. And it would be like a funnel that would get wider over time. So that would provide an opportunity for us to sort of ease into the market, develop maturity in the carbon market and for allowances over time, everybody get comfortable with it, and avoid a situation where things go haywire. Despite the fact that I've been known as kind of an advocate for climate change and dealing with it, what I've argued with policy leaders in California is that if we do something, you know, and we're first, and this derails and creates a crisis, we're going to set climate change work back so far, it'll be decades perhaps. And so what we've said is it's really important we get this right, and by having a cost collar, we create rails, in effect, where the price of carbon doesn't get too low and it doesn't get too high, but in between it acts under the influence of supply and demand for carbon allowances.
Thank you. Over here.
I have a question on like raising awareness. Most people, when they think of climate change, they think of like factories and burning fossil fuels. How do you raise awareness of the impacts caused by seemingly indirect industries, like for example the cattle industry?
You know, I think that educating people about climate change and the drivers of climate change is an opportunity for everybody. And some of the biggest challenges involve sources of heat-trapping compounds that don't come from carbon dioxide. Farm emissions are mostly methane and nitrous oxide. We know now that quite a lot of the climate forcing in Asia is a consequence of particulates in the atmosphere, basically soot. And this soot warms as a consequence of absorbing radiation in the atmosphere and also absorbing radiation on the surface, especially on glaciers. And the way I see it, it means there are lots of opportunities, a real diversity of ways and locations and techniques that can be used to attack the problems. But I also think that there's some level at which this problem really can only be dealt with if individuals and communities take responsibility. And I think that you know, we live in a complicated world, and people need to take responsibility to educate themselves sufficiently so they can make good decisions. And as a representative of the scientific community, I'm very enthusiastic about providing the information in the clearest possible way and working with other kinds of parties that work on clear communication. But this is a complicated issue, and sooner or later, our ability to make good decisions is really going to hinge on an educated public interacting with it in a serious way.
Also, let me answer that. I think there are two aspects. One is how to communicate, okay, the information. And earlier, Professor Field talking about communicating science. I think the same thing with communicating the technology. And I think many of us are impacted by impact by this, by watching inconvenient truth. Okay, so I think that's our collective effort at least in college engineering to say how we're going to communicate technology and these important issues to the general public. And so another thing here is also I can see that the university and this community has a big role to play. And because that it impacts everyone, the young people, and talking about this, our solutions or lack of solutions will impact your life and directly. And so also by your savvy user of media, okay, the social media, communicating that information and share that with your friends. Facebook has 500 million users, okay. So then I really challenge this group and to really see that how you can communicate and educate your peers, your classmates, your friends on these important issues and using the new technology.
Thank you. We have a question over here.
Yes. My name is David, double E major. I'd like to thank you guys for coming today. I'd like, Peter, if you could speak on the renewable resources portfolio. I understand 12% is going towards that right now. What are PG&E's plans on going above and beyond those requirements, and furthermore, specifically on solar?
Right. So where we stand is that about 18% of our portfolio currently comes from what are eligible renewables. You ought to also be aware that in total, about 50% of the generation that we either acquire by buying from parties or generate emits no carbon. So PG&E has the largest investor-owned hydro system in the country, and we also have a nuclear power plant at Diablo Canyon, and then on top of that we have solar and wind and other forms of renewable sources. So half of the power provided by PG&E emits no carbon whatsoever, which is arguably, it's either the cleanest portfolio in the country or one or two, something like that. A lot of people don't realize it, so Marin went out and said, we got to have clean energy, and they're going to struggle to get as clean energy as we currently provide, but people didn't want to engage in, looking into that. We're required over a period of 2010 to 2014 to have 20% of our power come from eligible receivables. Doesn't include hydro, doesn't include nuclear. We're currently at 18%. It looks like we're going to comply with that in the complicated math that they have. What has happened is the state has established as policy, energy policy, 33% by 2020, and we have not agreed with all of the proposed legislation because some people, particularly unions, have said that power, renewable power, has to come from within California. That's a really bad idea. And the reason is that there's a huge cost associated with renewables, and we want the cost to be as low as possible. And so saying it must come from California as opposed to neighboring states like Oregon or Nevada or Washington gets in the way of affordable power. The reality is when we talk to our customers, they say we're willing to pay like 5% premium, maybe 10% premium for renewable power. Well, the reality is that renewable power costs like 40% more or 100% more in certain instances. And so we need to do everything we can to bring down the cost of renewable power compared to conventional fired power. That said, we as a company support 33%, but if it's acquired in the least cost possible way, because otherwise we're going to have a revolt from our customers, and again, we're going to have a big backlash and setback. So our view is commitment to clean energy, but commitment to our customers at the lowest possible cost, and let's work on that together.
Do we have another question?
Hi, my name is Dan. Thank you very much for coming. I'm an energy policy focus here at San Jose State. I want to ask you a really crazy question. I'm a big believer in climate change. And I saw a really crazy show on TV about a conspiracy with the leader of the United Nations, I forgot his name, and how he invented the theory of climate change. and he's trying to spread this theory around the world so that he can create world domination and yeah, so he can control the economics, what people buy, how the world runs, the economies of the world run, what people purchase, how everything runs in the world is going to be based on this climate change. It's going to fear, and everything's going to be based on fear. Do you have any comments, since you guys are the experts? I mean, being such a big believer in climate change and everything, it seemed like it made sense a little bit that would be possible, that it would influence so many things. You know, I mean, it sounds crazy, but is this as crazy as it sounds? I mean, it was that Jesse Ventura thing, you know, that's him, the governor Ventura and his show.
Why don't you take a first crack at it, and then I'd like to follow up on it. So I think Chris can really address the scientific issue, and I can address the
I might preface it
non-scientific.
with, remember, Jesse Ventura used to be a wrestler, and he fell on his head a number of times.
Well, you know, it is crazy, and it's crazy from two important perspectives. The first is that science of climate change is really a very mature field. I already talked about Arrhenius in the 1890s. You know, the basic mechanisms of climate change really haven't been questioned since then. We've learned more and more through time, more about the mechanisms, more about the way the climate system works, and more about the kind of damages that we should anticipate if we don't do anything about it. The other direction that's important for people to understand is that taking sensible action to deal with climate change doesn't necessarily change everything in the society. I think of the response strategy for climate change as kind of being, I think of it as a house with four walls. And the four walls are conservation. I already mentioned forests. If we can conserve forests, that's an important component of decreasing emissions. Efficiency that Peter talked about is incredibly important. New technologies, bringing additional solar and wind into the grid, and then carbon capture and storage, finding a way that some of the CO2 that we're currently releasing to the atmosphere doesn't end up in the atmosphere and can end up in long-term storage. So with those four technologies all in place, I think we have the opportunity to address climate change in a way that's not very expensive, that provides a better quality of life in a context of increased energy security and increased distribution of opportunities, so that instead of talking about a world with increased domination by a particular interest, I think we actually are talking about moving away from a world where the interests of the fossil companies are so pervasive. So I see us actually moving toward an era of greater freedom and greater opportunity.
Let me just build on that. You all know that there are people who create stories in our society and non-truths. And there is plenty of incentive for people around the issue of carbon, if you're an oil company or if you're a coal company, you know, to create a rumor and innuendo. You know, historically, I was a conservative kind of Republican individual, and actually I'm always intrigued when you find Republicans who believe in climate change, because they've come from a position which wouldn't predispose them to have a view on climate change. And so what we did, I felt it was just incredibly important to find the answers on this. So we took the top 15 people of our company, and we met with those people who said, yes, climate change is an issue, and we met with the people that said, no, it isn't, and here's why. So I had dinner with you know, the representative from Exxon, you know, who really was a strong you know, proponent of there's no climate change. And we had dinner, we went through the whole thing, and in the end I said, so to sum up, your position really is you're not sure, and we need another 10 or 20 years of data before we can be sure. Is that a fair characterization? And he said, yes. And I said, wow. The chief, you know, expert from Exxon is saying, not no, but he's saying, We're not sure, and we need another 10 or 20 years of data to be really, really sure. And I said to myself, I don't have that luxury. The consequence of what we do, since utilities emit more carbon than any other sector, is I have to make a decision based on the best available information. Is this harmful or is it not? So I walked out of there totally amazed that that was the best Exxon could do. I shook my head. It's interesting, about a month or two later, he resigned, wondering if he had an issue there. The second thing is, Dick Lindzen is always rolled out by the Wall Street Journal as the guy from MIT, you know, who makes the case. Well, we talked with Dick Lindzen, and I'll tell you, in terms of peer-reviewed work, in terms of just being able to present his case, he was awful compared to the others. And what I've done is I've gone and talked to the faculty at MIT, and I said, well, you know, Dick Lindzen is always the guy rolled out. What do you think about him? Publicly, they say we don't really agree with him. Privately, their comments are much more clear and very impolite as to how they feel about Dick Lindzen. So if those are like two leading experts on the negative side, I don't think they presented a very good case. The guy who had the biggest impact on me is Dick Meserve, the president of the Carnegie Institution and a Republican, a former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He's devoted much of his life to studying this thing in the last decade. What he has said is this is the greatest challenge mankind has ever faced. That's something to listen to coming from someone that you wouldn't expect would have drawn that conclusion. Thank you.
I know there might be other questions, but we're at 1 o'clock, so I think we're probably at the end here. What I would encourage you to do, though, is actually look at this paper. It's a very interesting paper. It's 9 pages plus a page of bibliography or references. And to me, it's sort of, given the collegial setting, it's sort of cliff notes on climate change. And it'll give you, good, crisp information on it, and then more research there if you want to look it up. It's at the website, our corporate website, pgecorp.com. And I've got the whole URL, but you can actually just, there's a search box there, just put in climate paper, and you'll see that. I think it'd be worth your while. Thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.